She sat at the long conference table, gripping her notes tightly as she glanced around the room. The walls were lined with framed awards, shelves filled with success stories, none of which included her not yet. This was her chance, her moment to prove that her ideas mattered. But as she spoke, her voice strong despite the nervous energy coursing through her veins, she could already see it, the dismissive glances, the subtle eye rolls, the way they exchanged smirks, as if she had no idea what she was talking about. She had spent weeks preparing for this pitch, poring over research, refining every detail, making sure that every number, every projection, every potential risk was accounted for. But it didn't matter. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then, the responses came: polite smiles, lukewarm nods, and carefully worded rejections. Interesting concept, but not quite aligned with our direction. Maybe down the line, but right now, we have other priorities. It's ambitious. Perhaps too ambitious. The last comment cut the deepest. Too ambitious. Wasn't that the whole point? To aim higher, to push boundaries, to create something new? She felt the heat rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down, nodding as if their words didn't sting. She had heard it all before. As she walked out of the meeting, she could hear the murmurs behind her. They had already moved on, already forgotten the hours, the effort, the vision she had brought into that room. She knew she wasn't supposed to take it personally. It was just business, right? But that didn't make it hurt any less. Later that evening, she sat alone in her small apartment, her laptop open, the rejection emails still sitting in her inbox as if they were mocking her. Maybe she should just let it go, accept that the people in that boardroom knew better, that they were right to reject her. But deep down, something inside her refused to believe that. Because what if they were wrong? She looked at her notes again, at the data, at the undeniable potential of what she had created. She had spent too long waiting for approval, for someone to validate her ideas. If they didn't believe in them, fine. She would prove them wrong. With a deep breath, she opened a new document and started mapping out her plan, not for another pitch, not for another round of empty nods and condescending feedback. No, this time, she wasn't asking for permission. She was building it herself. And one day, they wouldn't just recognize her ideas, they'd be working for them that night. She barely slept, her mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and questions she couldn't yet answer. But beneath all of it was something far stronger than doubt: determination. If the people in that boardroom couldn't see her vision, she would build it without them. The next morning, she woke up early, made herself a strong cup of coffee, and sat down at her desk, ready to turn an idea into reality. The first step was finding out what she truly needed to get started. She didn't have millions of dollars or a massive team behind her, but she had something just as valuable: her knowledge, her skills, and an unshakable belief in her idea. She listed out every resource she could use, every potential obstacle she might face, and every small step she could take. This wasn't going to be easy, but she had spent too long waiting for the perfect conditions. If she wanted this to work, she had to start now. She reached out to people she trusted, former colleagues, mentors, even a few strangers in the industry who had built something from the ground up. Some responded with encouragement, others with skepticism, but there were a few who offered real advice, the kind that only came from experience. She soaked it all in, refining her approach with every conversation. Days turned into weeks, and she found herself completely immersed in the process. She worked late into the nights, learning everything she could about funding, marketing, and the logistical challenges of launching something on her own. She had never worked harder in her life, but for the first time, every effort felt like it mattered. Every decision was hers, every setback was a lesson, and every small victory was a step closer to something bigger. Of course, there were moments of doubt. There were nights when exhaustion made her question everything, when she wondered if those executives had been right all along. Maybe she was in over her head. Maybe this was too ambitious. But every time those thoughts crept in, she reminded herself why she had started. She refused to let their rejection define her. Then came the first breakthrough. After weeks of refining her concept, she launched a small test version of her idea. No big announcements, no flashy marketing, just a simple introduction to see if real people would connect with it. And to her surprise, they did. The response was slow at first, but it was real. People weren't just interested, they were excited. They wanted more. With that small success, she pushed harder. She reinvested every dollar she earned back into her work, improving, expanding, and learning as she went. What started as a single concept slowly evolved into something bigger, something undeniable. She knew the real test would come when the same people who had dismissed her before finally took notice. And that moment arrived sooner than she expected. One day, she received an email from a familiar name, one of the executives who'd once brushed her off without a second thought. Their tone was different this time. They wanted to talk. But she wasn't in a rush to reply. She had spent too much time proving herself to people who never believed in her. Now, the choice was hers, and she wasn't sure if they deserved a second chance. She stared at the email, the words blurring slightly as she read them over again. Just months ago, these same people had dismissed her ideas without hesitation, barely giving her a second glance as they moved on to their next meeting. Now, they were reaching out, acting as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent countless nights building something on her own while they carried on as usual. It was almost amusing. Almost. Instead of replying immediately, she let the message sit in her inbox. She had learned that power didn't come from reacting, it came from knowing when to act and when to wait. Besides, she had more important things to focus on. Her company was growing faster than she had anticipated, and while that was exciting, it also meant new challenges. Investors were beginning to take notice, competitors were quietly watching, and every decision she made now carried more weight than ever before. Behind the scenes, her small but dedicated team was working tirelessly. She had built something special, not just a product, but a culture where people felt valued, where ideas mattered no matter where they came from. That was something no corporate meeting room could ever replicate. Still, she knew that success in business wasn't just about innovation. It was about strategy, and she had to be prepared for what was coming next. One of her biggest challenges was funding. Growth required resources, and while she had bootstrapped her way to this point, she knew she couldn't do it alone forever. The thought of bringing in outside investors was complicated. She had worked too hard to build this on her own terms. She wasn't about to let someone else dictate her vision. But without the right support, expansion would be difficult. It was a delicate balance, and she had to figure it out fast. Meanwhile, there was another complication. Someone from her past had resurfaced. An old colleague, one who had quietly left the company after her ideas were rejected, reached out with an offer to collaborate. Unlike the executives who had ignored her before, this person had always believed in her vision. Now, they were offering something valuable: industry connections, insider knowledge, and a potential partnership that could change everything. But trust was a fragile thing, and she had learned the hard way that not everyone who seemed supportive had good intentions. As she weighed her options, the pressure continued to build. Every day brought new challenges: supply chain issues, unexpected legal hurdles, competitors launching similar products. It was a constant battle to stay ahead, to prove not just to others, but to herself, that she could do this. And through it all, the email from the executives remained unanswered. She knew they were waiting. She imagined their meetings, their discussions, trying to figure out how to approach her, how to convince her to sit at their table again. But the truth was, she wasn't the same person they had dismissed. She had built something they couldn't ignore. And when she finally decided to respond, it wouldn't be on their terms. It would be on hers. She sat in her office, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face as she scrolled through the latest reports. Growth was strong, stronger than she had ever expected, but with that growth came challenges she hadn't fully prepared for. The demand for their product was skyrocketing, but they were struggling to keep up. Manufacturing delays, unexpected costs, and supply chain disruptions were becoming more frequent. Every solution seemed to open the door to a new problem, and the weight of it all pressed heavily on her shoulders. And then there was the email. Still unanswered. She knew they were waiting for her response. She could almost hear them debating their next move, trying to predict what she would do. But she wasn't in a rush. The power dynamics had shifted, and for the first time, she held the leverage. They had rejected her ideas, dismissed her potential, and now they needed her. It would have been easy to fire off a response, to remind them of what they had done, but she wasn't interested in revenge. She wanted something bigger. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her team, another delay, this time from a key supplier. They needed to find an alternative, and fast. The competition wasn't slowing down, and if they didn't act quickly, they could lose the momentum they had fought so hard to build. She grabbed her coat and headed out. There was no time to sit in an office waiting for answers. She needed solutions. As she drove across the city, she replayed everything in her mind. The late nights, the rejection, the sacrifices. Every time she had been told no, every time she had been underestimated, it had all led to this moment. She had built something real, something undeniable. But was it enough? She pulled up to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, where one of her potential new suppliers was located. The air was crisp, and the weight of the moment settled in her chest. She had worked hard to get here, but she knew this wasn't the end. This was just another battle in a much larger fight. As she stepped inside, she felt it, the tension, the uncertainty, the pressure. Everything was riding on what happened next. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure how it would all turn out. The warehouse smelled of raw metal and freshly cut wood. Machines whirred in the background as workers moved with practiced precision. She scanned the room, searching for the contact she was supposed to meet. This deal could change everything. If they could secure this supplier, they'd finally break free from the delays that had been plaguing them for weeks. A man approached her, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral. "You must be here for the contract discussion." His voice was flat, professional, but there was something guarded about his tone. She nodded, shaking his hand firmly. "Yes. I want to see what you can offer." He led her through the warehouse, explaining the production process, the capacity, the quality standards they upheld. It was everything she had been hoping for: efficient, scalable, and reliable. But something felt off. As they reached his office, he hesitated for a moment before opening the door. "Before we move forward, there's something you should know." She tensed. That was never a good way to start a conversation. "Go on." He sighed, setting the clipboard down on his desk. "Your old company reached out to us." Her stomach dropped. She kept her face calm, but her mind was already racing. "And they offered a deal. A big one. Bigger than what you're asking for." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay composed. Of course they did. They had ignored her ideas, refused to see her potential. And now, instead of owning up to their mistake, they were trying to undercut her. "But here's the thing," he continued, watching her closely. "They also gave us a warning. They said working with you could be risky." Her pulse quickened. "Risky how?" He hesitated. "They didn't go into detail. Just hinted that your business might not be as stable as it seems." She exhaled slowly. This was a move she hadn't expected, not just competition, but direct sabotage. They weren't just trying to win, they were trying to make sure she lost. She met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "And do you believe them?" He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "I believe in facts." And right now, I need to decide whether betting on you is worth losing a guaranteed deal with them." The weight of the moment pressed down on her. This wasn't just about a supplier anymore. This was about proving she was stronger than the forces working against her. And for that, she needed a plan. Her mind raced, considering her next move. She couldn't just fight back, she had to outmaneuver them. She had come too far to let them pull her under now. The stakes had never been higher, and she was ready. She kept her expression calm, but inside, her mind was already working through the possibilities. They had underestimated her once, and now they were trying to do it again. She wouldn't let them win. Leaning forward, she met the supplier's gaze. "I understand your concerns, and I won't ask you to take my word over theirs. But what I will do is show you why partnering with me is the better long-term choice." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. She pulled out her tablet and swiped to a set of projections she had prepared in case something like this happened. "I know their strategy. They throw money at problems to keep control. But look at their growth pattern. They're plateauing. Their model relies on outdated methods, which means suppliers like you will eventually feel the squeeze. I, on the other hand, have built my business to scale sustainably. We're using modern processes, cutting-edge logistics, and adaptive marketing. We're not just competing, we're setting a new standard." She could see the flicker of doubt in his expression, the calculations running through his head. She wasn't done yet. "And let's talk about risk. The real risk isn't working with me. It's aligning with a company that sees you as disposable. They'll use you while it benefits them, then move on the moment they find a cheaper option. With me, you're getting a partner, not just a contract." Silence stretched between them. He exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk. "You make a good case. Then let me prove it," she pressed. "Give me a 3-month contract. No long-term commitments yet. If I don't deliver on everything I've promised, you can walk away, no penalties." He studied her for a long moment before nodding all right. 3 months. Relief rushed through her, but she didn't let it show. This was just the first step. Now she had to make sure she delivered. But as she left the meeting, her phone buzzed. A message popped up on the screen. "We need to talk." Now, it was from someone she never expected to hear from again. Someone who had once been on her side until they weren't. She stared at the message, heart pounding. If they were reaching out now, it meant something was happening behind the scenes. Something big. The fight wasn't over yet, and the final battle was about to begin. She didn't turn around immediately. Years of instinct told her that any sudden move could give them an advantage. Instead, she inhaled slowly, steadying herself. The night air felt colder now, the weight of unseen threats pressing in. "I should have known you'd be watching," she said, keeping her voice level. The figure behind her chuckled, a slow, deliberate sound. "You always were the sharp one. But you made a mistake tonight." She finally turned. 2 men stood in the dim light, their stances rigid, eyes locked on her like predators circling their prey. She recognized one of them, someone who had once sat across from her in boardrooms, smiling while shaking her hand. Now, there was no pretense. "You think you can stop this?" he continued. "It's already done. We've spent months preparing. You walking away now is the only way you don't lose everything." She crossed her arms. "And if I don't?" The man smirked. "Then we make sure you regret it." For a long moment, she didn't speak. The anger simmering inside her was controlled, but powerful. She had spent years proving herself, rebuilding from the ground up after every setback. And now, they expected her to surrender? She took a step forward, watching how they tensed. "The problem with threats," she said calmly, "is that they only work when the person you're threatening has something to lose." Their expressions flickered. "What makes you think I haven't already prepared for this?" She continued. "You're not the only ones who have been planning. You underestimated me once before. That was your mistake. The man's smirk faltered. He glanced at his partner, as if silently asking whether she was bluffing. But she wasn't. She had spent weeks digging, uncovering every connection, every weakness. And she wasn't alone. Even as she spoke, her team was already moving. The contracts they thought they had sabotaged, rewritten and secured. The suppliers they had pressured, they had already signed exclusive deals with her. The reputation they planned to ruin, she had the truth waiting to be exposed. She took out her phone, scrolling to a message she had drafted earlier. With one tap, the entire industry would see proof of their backdoor dealings, the way they had manipulated the market, the corruption that ran deeper than anyone had guessed. "You see," she said, holding up the screen, "you never controlled the game. You just thought you did." Their expressions shifted from confidence to barely concealed panic. The man stepped forward as if to stop her, but she pressed send. It was over. By the next morning, the fallout had already begun. Headlines flooded every major business site. Investors pulled out, clients cut ties, and the men who had once sat in the highest positions now scrambled to save themselves. She watched it all unfold from her office, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about proving that she had built something real, something no one could take away. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him standing there, the one who had warned her, the one who had betrayed her, but ultimately chosen to do the right thing. "You did it," he said. She nodded. "We did." There was silence between them. A complicated, unspoken history hung in the air. But she didn't need to dwell on it. The past was the past. "You're free now," he said after a moment. "No one can touch you." She smiled faintly. "I was always free. They just didn't realize it." As he left, she turned back to the city skyline. There was no going back to the way things were. But that was the point. She had built something stronger. And now, she was moving forward on her own terms.